Welcome to the Informed Simplicity Project, where we're taking a shared journey to learn more about our bodies. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Harris, with my co-host, Dr. Julia Conroy. Julia, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm getting excited. Let's talk
Good.
cardiovascular
Yes, today we're
system.
talking about the heart. I'm really excited about this. Um, and what I wanted to do with this episode is just sort of like do a brief recap of everything that we've sort of talked about,
Mhm.
right? So in this series, we're talking about how stress affects our emotional and physical health. And the way that, and in order to understand this, we're talking a lot about the autonomic nervous system. And there's this older model of the autonomic nervous system that says, hey, this part of you has two parts that are sort of in a tug of war, right? One pauses us, we call that the parasympathetic, and one speeds us up, we call that the sympathetic part. And these two parts are always fighting it out. And what we really want is we want to be more in parasympathetic, right? That's what slows us down and helps us to connect to people and helps us to keep calm.
Mhm.
The old model says that, right? The new model, the polyvagal model, says, wait, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, right?
Mhm.
That actually the way that we're wired is more like a ladder.
Mhm.
And at the top of that ladder, yeah, we want to be in pause, we want to be in parasympathetic, because that helps us to connect to people, helps our bodies to heal and grow. Like in general, it's a really good thing. But when we're faced with threat, we move down the ladder, and it's completely normal, into this part of us that speeds us up in order to protect us.
Mhm. Mhm.
And this is when we get all these sort of fight or flight behaviors.
Mhm. Mhm.
And if this level gets overwhelmed and we feel like, man, we might die, then we go to the bottom rung of the ladder, which is completely normal as well, where we pause again in order to protect ourselves.
Mhm.
So the parasympathetic comes back online and we go, okay, we're going to sort of shut down, we're going to dissociate, we're going to faint in order to keep ourselves safe. It's another protective way of handling big challenges and big threats.
Mhm.
So that's sort of all the stuff that that's an overview of all the stuff we've talked about in the past episodes.
Mhm.
And today we're going to take this new lens and look at our cardiovascular system.
Mhm.
Okay. Sounds good?
That sounds great.
Sounds good. So I am really excited about this chapter, right? We're looking at Robert Sapolsky's Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And this chapter for me is really exciting because it's all about the cardiovascular system.
Mhm.
And I'm really excited about this for two big reasons. One is I learned so much about my body. Like there's so many things I just never knew about
Yeah.
me. There's so many vocab words that suddenly make sense now. Things I've
Mm.
heard on like ER or Grey's Anatomy or Scrubs, and I'm like, I don't know what that means. And suddenly I'm like, oh, that's exactly what I now know what that means. Um,
Mhm.
so that was really cool.
Mhm.
And also, I really enjoyed this chapter because I feel like this is the first chapter where we go in depth into a specific system and look at
Mhm.
how stress impacts that system.
Right.
Um, and so I think it gave me a much more clear view of
Mhm.
what we're talking about. So I'm really
Yeah.
excited.
Most definitely. And as clinicians, we talk a lot about the heart, uh, from one specific capacity of how's your heart? Tell me what that does for your heart there, right? And kind of this emotional side of that. But especially when we're doing in this series, what polyvagal theory does so well, what Sapolsky does so well in his work is let's look at the person holistically. If we really want to attend to the whole person, right? That this doesn't replace any knowledge, this doesn't, supplant the things that we study with regard to mental health, but it complements that knowledge so we can have a fuller appreciation, not just as we're watching reruns of ER and Grey's Anatomy and whatever it is, but also that we understand what goes in our bodies. When we're stressed, for clinicians that might be listening, what really happens for your clients in those moments where they feel moments of distress. It's this holistic perspective that really allows us to appreciate the full body experience that is stress.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think as we get into this, it's just so normalizing, like, okay, this is what bodies do when they're stressed. So there's nothing out of the ordinary about that. So look, when we look at this, one of the things that I think everybody knows on a very general level is that when you are stressed, right, and you're sort of in that middle rung, right, and your body feels like, okay, there's a challenge, there's a threat, there's a stressor, but it's not overwhelming. It's not a death level stressor. Your heart rate often spikes.
Absolutely.
And what Sapolsky says in the book is that three things happen, right? Your heart rate spikes, that's one of them. There's a changes in your blood vessels, and then your kidneys also change in how they function.
Yeah.
And so those are sort of the three big, I'm going to say, like, systems and organs he talks about in this section.
Right.
But the thing that I think that's really obvious and is intuitively grasped is, okay, my heart rate speeds up. But your blood vessels also change, and you really brought up a very nuanced view of this. So I'm going to give my take, and then I'm going to have you go back and fix all the problems. Because one of the things that happens when we encounter a stressor is that our blood vessels dilate, right? And this is a good thing, because that means that our hearts can pump more blood, and that blood can carry all that nutrients to our muscles, which really need it. But you were saying actually it's more nuanced than that. Can you sort of go into that?
It is, because in those moments, right, and we mentioned this last episode too, of talking about this idea of the allostatic load, which is basically the degree of stress the body is under as it tries to get us back to homeostasis, where we're in optimum functioning. And so what's really important is we can't just generalize, okay, all the blood vessels constrict, all of them dilate, all of them do this, because really the goal of the body is, how do I get energy to where it needs to be so that I can be restored in that balance, right? And so what we find in that research is that actually the blood vessels that are returning blood to the heart, those constrict. Those get more rigid. They get tighter. It's harder to pump blood through them, so that the body speeds up, right, its output, and is pumping blood forward with more kind of veracity in those moments. So it actually gets more challenging to get blood to the heart during moments of distress, during moments of stress. And it's because of this that the heart kind of takes a beating because this is like pretty intense. This is a lot more exertion on the heart to get the blood there in the first place, and then to do its thing once it's there, because there's like this high impact coming in. But just like you said, that's not true of every blood vessel in the body, because as the body is looking to mobilize itself, it needs to make sure it has plenty of energy flow, plenty of access to our limbs, which the body deems to be most vital during moments of distress. So the pathways that my body has to get blood to my hands, to my legs, like the things that are most essential, right, physically, to have that fight or flight response, those doorways open up more loosely so that blood and energy can get there quick. But as far as kind of blood vessels to less essential operating functions, and there's 100 of those. But the one referenced specifically here in this section is the kidneys. That those are like, this is not essential here. We don't need these for fight or flight. Let's slow down access there. And so those also constrict just because the body is prioritizing what is most essential and what's going to be most adaptive in that fight or flight response.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and it makes more sense of some of the things that we talked about a little later, right? So basically what you're saying is the outgoing blood, the blood going from your heart to the rest of your body, that goes through blood vessels that have been opened, that have been dilated. But the blood that is going into the heart, right, from the body into the heart, those are coming in through blood vessels that have constricted, that have gotten smaller.
Right.
And so with this, and also when your blood is sending out the blood in these more open, when your heart is sending out the blood in these more open blood vessels, it's not sending it to your whole body. It's sending it to the parts of you that are needed for the flight or flight sort of behaviors, right? For your arms or your hands, and not for other stuff like your kidneys or your guts. Those are not needed. You don't need to give energy to those systems at that time.
Absolutely. And a lot of stressors that we're experiencing now in 2021 or 22, whenever you're listening to this, that a lot of those stressors, it's like, okay, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't help for me to have like more blood flowing to my legs. Our bodies haven't caught up, right, to the stressors. It's still preparing us for those primarily physical stressors that were far more pressing, right, in years prior to this. And so you can still feel this. I think everyone knows this experience of when I'm stressed or like in a meeting, it's like, I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of there. Like I felt really antsy. I couldn't stop my fingers from fidgeting. Like my foot was kicking. It's because during those moments of distress, even though I'm just sitting there, right, my blood is still doing the same thing. All of it's getting pumped to my outer limbs, preparing me for that physical fight or flight. Even though it's not necessary in a lot of the stressful situations that we experience. So it's not concerning to know that someone's fidgety during moments of distress or that their foot's popping. They don't know what's going on in those moments, right? But their body is mobilizing them because it's interpreting that distress as, shoot, you got to run or you got to put up some sort of fight. We're going to get you everything you need to do those two functions. They're just not as applicable in the stressful situations we find ourselves in now.
I mean, I think to me, that's the whole point of looking at this. Like, that's the point of Porges, and that's the point of Sapolsky, right? Sapolsky's whole thing is we have this response to stress a lot like zebras do. But the difference is zebras don't get stressed out. They don't feel threatened by like a math test, right? like that's the difference between us and zebras. We have the same general response, but we're living in different contexts. And the context that humans find ourselves in is more social, more psychological. And so, yeah, you're sitting in a meeting and your heart is racing, but your body's responding just like a zebra does when it's on the savannah.
Exactly. And so I think my body's malfunctioning.
Right.
I'm like, I don't need this. I don't need to run. I don't need to be faster. I don't need to be more mobile. I'm not going to, hopefully in most meetings, resort to a fist fight. But your body's like, I'm equipping you for that. You're stressed. These are your two good responses when you're in this degree of stress. And so I think it's really important to understand your body's not malfunctioning in this space. It's evolutionarily doing what it was programmed to do to keep you safe.
Yeah.
It's not always relevant for the settings that we find ourselves in now, but that doesn't mean that your body's doing something wrong.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I think that also leads to the second thing that I've learned from polyvagal theory about this stuff is when you're in that state, you're primed for those behaviors. And I think when we're talking to people, the more that we understand this material and we see what state they're in, the more we can empathize with them and then help them, right?
Absolutely.
Because when this is going on for us, when we're sitting in that meeting and our fingers are, twitching and we're feeling jittery in the chair, it doesn't help to be like, whoa, don't feel that way, Bob. like, you know what I mean? What you need is the same thing that in some ways, like those zebras need, right? Like zebras, how do they run? They run in herds. They run in packs. I guess not packs because they're, like zebras, but like they need that community and they need the stressor to be removed. And until you do that, it's very hard to get a zebra to do anything else. And it's the same way with us.
Absolutely. And I think that is kind of, I'm not going to use the word hopeless, but I kind of just did. That's the really challenging part about this old way of thinking about sympathetic versus parasympathetic. I can't remove every stressful situation from my life, right? And I can't train my body to not be anxious when stress comes up. I can't teach myself to do that. There are just situations that warrant stress, and that's okay. But the hopeful part of the polyvagal perspective is that the issue is that we become rigid in our response to stress, that our body automatically opts for that fight or flight response, even when that physical response isn't necessary.
Yeah.
And that we can have flexibility in the way that our body responds to stress, right? And the new door, the new pathway that polyvagal opens up for us is that there is a social engagement system, right? And that there's some types of stress where I can train my body to recognize I don't need to physically activate and respond to this type of stress. I can shoot a quick text in that meeting. I can look at my coworker next to me and make, the eye contact that's like, do you see what's happening here? Right. And I can look for little moments of connection there that alleviate that stress instead of just trying to suppress it and stop my body from activating in that fight or flight traditional response that we often remain stuck in.
I love that. And I think that is a hopeful picture, right? And I think that also dovetails into the flip side of this and sort of like the next part of the book, right? Because when you can't do that, or when you haven't been able to do that, right, and your heart rate is chronically elevated, right? When you haven't been able to use social engagement, sort of that first rung of the ladder, to re-get your balance, to reset, and you're chronically activated, your heart is chronically elevated, and the blood going out is going through these open blood vessels really intensely, right? Part of what that does to your body physically is it causes those blood vessels to then take more pressure, which means that they thicken and they get harder. And on the far end of this, right, that's what leads to things like hypertension, which is chronically high blood pressure. And for me, I was like, oh, that's what I never knew what hypertension really meant. I go to Walmart and get my blood pressure taken. I'm like, what is it? What does that mean? And it's like, oh,
yeah,
it means that my body, for whatever reason, is a little bit, if it's high, if I have hypertension, is a little bit on the mobilized side, sort of chronically, and that's also where heart disease comes in. And I didn't know what heart disease meant, but what does it do to your heart to constantly be running at this high speed? And he talks about it in the book of like how heart disease is one of the leading sort of causes of death for people. It's like, wow, this stuff also impacts your body very, very viscerally.
Absolutely. Because like we said, the point of the stress response, right? The way that we talked about how the heart speeds up, some of the blood vessels constrict, some of them dilate, the kidneys shut down. All of that is done in an attempt to get you energy quickly to where your body assesses that you need it most. That is such a good thing, right? When a bear is chasing me through the woods, I am so glad my body does that, right? But what happens when my primary source of stress is that I am running into stressful situations moment after moment after
At work
moment
or at
after moment,
school or
at
yeah,
school, at home,
at home,
right?
right?
And on the way to home in the traffic, like all of it just presents stress after stress after stress, which keeps our body in that elevated state, keeps our body from having this moment where the blood vessels can resume normal functioning, where the blood flow can operate in the way that it's meant to and spread throughout the entire body, right? And that the kidneys can operate in the way that they're meant to, that this touches every aspect of our physical functioning, because our bodies stay in that place where they're trying to prioritize the physical response to
Yeah.
stress.
So I actually have a question for you here, right?
Mhm.
So the third part, the third organ, the third section of this book talks about how blood pressure affects your kidneys.
Mhm.
And I actually have a question for you here, right? When I've studied Porges' work and Polyvagal Theory, he often talks about how organs below the diaphragm are
Mhm.
the ones that are really impacted
Mhm.
by the freeze response, right? By
Mhm.
sort of that bottom rung of that polyvagal ladder.
Mhm.
And so he talks about how people who've often been traumatized will defecate during the trauma.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I've always wondered, what about like peeing yourself, right? In the
Mhm.
book, Sapolsky presents, wetting yourself as something that your body does when it's in that middle rung, when you're in that sort of
Mhm.
fight or flight. Um, but when you're peeing yourself, that's organs below the diaphragm, right? So like, do
Yeah.
we know where that falls in the hierarchy? Do
Yeah.
we not
It's
know
a
yet?
little bit nuanced here and awfully specific. And so what we actually find in that urine secretion is um, if the urine has been released to the bladder, that's different, right? And the body's like, we've got, because the bladder is just one direction. It's like, if it's already been sent, it's like, this is dead weight. It's one direction. Like, we got to get out of here. And it will empty the dead weight, because it's like, this extra however many ounces is not going to be helpful in the fighting that we're doing. We've got to release, we've got to empty, we've got to get it out of here. However, if it's still being processed within the kidneys, what we'll actually find is that the kidneys, because the blood flow has been slowed there, that often, and there's some studies kind of debating this back and forth, that the body will actually kind of like dissolve that old energy and use it to hydrate the system, and hydrate the blood, because the blood is so dehydrated that at that point, in a sustained period of stress. And so you won't have to go if it hasn't been released yet. And so that's typically when we see someone in a fight or flight state, wetting themselves. That's usually because it's already been sent to the bladder. Once it's sent there, there's only one thing that can happen. So the body just releases it to, again, optimize that capacity for fight or flight.
Wow, that's amazing. It just depends on where it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which a lot of us aren't aware of. If you
Yeah.
are, please contact us immediately. Science will want to study you.
Uh, um, so there's also a few vocab terms that I really liked in this part of the book.
Mm.
Um, but before we get to too many of those, the other thing that I thought was fascinating was, we hear so much about the heart and
Mhm.
cholesterol, right? And how that causes all sorts of problems for us. Um, and recently I've heard a bunch of people on Twitter, and I've heard a bunch of anecdotes of people being like, yeah, well, it doesn't really matter your level of cholesterol. And I was like, well, what's the truth here? And what was fascinating was when he's talking about heart disease, right?
Mhm.
He says, actually, the best predictor for heart disease is not the levels of cholesterol in your blood, right?
Mhm.
Which I was like, okay. but the levels of inflammation, right?
Yeah.
And so basically what he says is that when you're in that sort of chronically elevated state,
Mhm.
there's more inflammation in the blood vessels. And
Mhm.
that's a better predictor of heart disease. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like that alone blew my brain.
Yeah,
Because then it really
absolutely.
is more about like the level of stress
Mhm.
and how you're responding to this thing.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think again that this is us taking a holistic perspective actually ushers in a degree of hope here because it's kind of like a nature nurture
Mm,
situation where of course you can't dismiss the reality that heart disease runs in family, that increases your likelihood, those genetics are passed on in that way, but also probably some coping strategies were passed on from generation to generation. And if I watched my parents and their parents suppress and just buckle down and keep going and not reach out and to muscle through and the whole bootstraps thing, which I just refuse to say the whole phrase. It's too ridiculous. It's physically impossible to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Anyway, if
except
I
in math.
watch that, yeah, if I watch that happen, then I'm probably going to develop coping strategies that are going to promote a pretty heightened stress response. And so having this holistic perspective, I think, gives a lot of hope where it's like, I'm not just destined for heart disease, right? If I can find a way to de escalate my body, right, and get it back to its allostatic balance, then I give it the recovery that it needs to promote healthier heart functioning. And I think that just offers a lot of hope, but a lot of maybe awareness of kind of the multiple factors that impact that, which I think are kind of necessary too from a medical model, which we're hearing more and more that being appreciated. But I think that that's a really important piece too. This offers hope that it's not just you're born with it or you're not. I have high cholesterol or I don't. My capacity and my awareness of how I can get my body out of this de escalated state and look for other ways to channel that stress actually could improve my heart functioning.
Yeah. Wow. That's a big idea. I'm not destined for this just because my dad had this and my mom had this. Actually, the better I'm able to co-regulate with other people, the better I'm able to use a social engagement system, the better my body is at going back to homeostatic or allostatic
Mhm.
balance.
Mhm.
That's the biggest predictor of like my health long term.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so I want to
Mm.
say that specific because it was just so good, right? It's not like we're making this so simple as like just connect with other people when you're stressed and it's fine. What you're doing, right, from a physiological perspective, right, is you're telling your body, hey, I don't need to be prepped for a physical fight or flight when every stress comes up. There
Yeah.
is another option of how to manage that stress, right? And from a polyvagal theory perspective, my options are to connect with others and to be soothed in that co regulation, and that decreases my need to get elevated and to get activated. And so that's really what we're talking about there is training your body. There can be some flexibility in the
Yeah.
way that I respond to stress. I don't always need to be prepped for this physical fight.
Yeah. 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 I think that's so good. Um, so one of the other things that he talks about in the book is so when your blood pressure goes up, right, and your body's pumping all this blood out, trying to get nutrients and supplies, part of what happens then is that those nutrients, if you're chronically elevated, stay in your blood for a long time. Your
Mm,
body's sort of constantly pushing that out. And that's how plaques form. And I never knew that's where plaques came from.
mhm,
And when these plaques are floating throughout your body, they can cause a lot of issues, right? And so if a plaque is free floating, he says that's a thrombus, I think he calls it. Oh my gosh, I never knew that.
Look at these vocab words.
So many vocab words. Like I can go back and just watch Scrubs and, but also, and that can cause a myocardic infarction or a heart attack, right? When this thrombus, this free floating plaque, this combination of glucose and fat and all this stuff your body's pumping out to give itself energy. If that's chronically in your blood, it can congeal, form a plaque. If the plaque gets loose, it's a thrombus, and it can go into your heart, and that's what causes a heart attack. And I was like, okay, now I know what thrombus means, what myocardial infarction means. Which is just crazy. It's just crazy. Yeah. And then also, go ahead.
Well, yeah, because we hear these terms, right? And it just feels like they're so strictly medical, right? And it feels like this is just what my body does. It just has this. Maybe it's because of what I eat. Maybe it's because of the family history that I have. But also what's so important, what Zapolsky is saying here is, but some of that too is a result of your body being in a consistently elevated state.
Yeah.
Right. And is needing to pump out these things because it's trying to prep you for that physical battle that's coming up. Right. And this is its way of protecting you. But when that protection is needed for such a great percentage of the time, these are kind of the devastating consequences that this can have long term.
Yeah.
And again, the hope here is, it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And then he also talks about arterial sclerosis, which is one of those words that I'm like, man, I thought that was a dinosaur. What is that? And it's like, okay, when you have multiple of these plaques, that's what arterial sclerosis is. And again, a lot of this, like you're saying, is influenced by your physiological ability to use the social engagement system, the top rung of that ladder. And so there's hope. The better we can use that, the better we have, the more flexibility that we have, then the easier it is to for our bodies to regulate and deal with these issues instead of having these problems sort of come up. I thought that was fascinating.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about so the last part of this book, of this chapter, I think it gets really interesting. Because he talks about sudden cardiac death and voodoo death, fatal pleasures, and it's just like, whoa. And I think this is the part where he doesn't know it, but he's talking sort of polyvagal theory, right? Because basically what he's saying is your heart specifically, and I'm going to have to help you. I'm going to have you really clean this up. But your heart specifically doesn't always know if the elevation is for a good reason or a bad reason.
Yeah, all it knows is that it's activated.
All it knows is that it's activated. And so people will faint, he says, when they're in like the throes of pleasure, and also when they're in the throes of threat. It's like, man, I am just too elevated. And what he does is he says this is a part of sort of the fight or flight response. But I think what we would say is that fainting is more a protective response. Your heart is basically saying, hey, it's too high, this is too much. Like we've got to sort of shut down for a little bit.
And to be clear here, he specifies like these are people that tend to have these symptoms are ones that don't have super healthy hearts to begin with. But this isn't seen in, if you've got an average healthy heart, then this isn't going to be as likely, but he kind of distinguishes, this is kind of when your body has gotten pretty stuck in some rigidity, right? And so it just interprets, even when I get excited, when I get good news, like I can feel my heart beating faster. It's like, this is exciting. And their bodies are so stuck in rigidity, right? In that panic response, it's like, oh, heart's beating fast, shoot, like I know what this means. This means the same thing every time. I'm also responding to it as if it's a threat.
Mm. That's really interesting, because when he talks about fatal pleasures, he talks about, I'm going to just read this quote. Put another way, and he says, your sympathetic nervous system probably has roughly the same impact on your coronary arteries, whether you are in the middle of murderous rage or thrilling or orgasm. And having studied the polyvagal stuff, I was a little bit familiar with how you can faint when you're sort of at the bottom rung of that. But I remember when you're at the bottom rung of the response hierarchy, right? The polyvagal hierarchy. But I remember being in a training with Porges, and he shows this video of, and I wish I could find the video, of this guy on Dr. Phil meeting his father for the first time. And Dr. Phil surprises him, right? So the guy's sitting down, talking to Dr. Phil about, man, I wish I knew my dad, you know, yada, yada, yada. Dr. Phil says, well, he's right behind you. And the man stands up and just faints. And Porges says something about it, and he goes on it. And I was like, wait, how is like what is going on here? This is a good thing. This thing he's wanted his entire life, he finally gets, and he's responding out of this really protective way. And from what you're saying, it's like, okay, that's because, you know, how is his body already primed to respond?
Yeah. And I would imagine, right, if he's saying something like that, they don't have this super close, healthy bond. That maybe like issues around his father have always maybe been stressful and have always been pretty anxiety producing and have always been pretty threatening to his system, right? So even in a positive moment where I'm getting the very thing that I want, my heart rate starts to elevate, right? Just out of the surprise, out of all of it, the excitement. And his body recognizes that as, oh, we've been here before. This is threat. This isn't a good thing. This is overwhelming amount of increase in arousal. Shoot, we need to like make sure that you're safe. We need to make sure this doesn't become too much, right? That it doesn't get overloaded. And that's where you see something like that happen. But it's confusing, right? Because it doesn't feel like it makes sense. He just said that he wanted that. Why would his body do that? Right? It's because, especially when we've been stuck in rigidity, our body isn't good at determining what the best response is. It only knows one way.
Yeah. I think even that is so, it just reframes the whole narrative around that. Because like, okay, this makes sense. It actually is totally, it's not outside of the realm of possibility. It's not weird. It's not strange. It's like, okay, this is what happens. This is how our bodies are wired to respond, are built to respond, have evolved to respond when we're faced with something that is overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then probably because of his history, this specific thing was more overwhelming than other things. I mean, he's on Dr. Phil for a reason, right? Talking about his dad.
Not because my life is so painfully
not because he has a great
average and
relationship with his dad. Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was really interesting. And that leads into what he calls, what's Sapolsky talks about, is voodoo death, right? These very strange situations where, you know, in maybe hunter-gatherer societies, and he talks about people in Haiti, where they are cursed by someone in their group, and then a few days later they end up dying, right? And I think one of the things that he does really well is he says, hey, like, there's probably different reasons for this, which I think is actually very wise. It's very scientific, right? I could have offended you, and you could have poisoned me, and then that's maybe the reason that I died. But everyone thinks it's because you cursed me, right? I could have offended you, and I'm already on my deathbed, and so I was going to die anyway. But because we know that when people are faced with a big threat, and they go to that bottom rung of the hierarchy, and they faint, they pass out, the heart rate plummets,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really hard on mammals.
Mm-hmm.
That sometimes when you are cursed and you're socially isolated,
Mm-hmm.
your heart rate can shut down, and it
Mm-hmm.
ends up with you dying.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Because who is dying to hang out with a cursed person,
Right.
right? And that's a part of it too. But also, if I'm told I'm going to die within 24 hours, think about, but I don't know when it's coming. I don't know what it's going to look like. Oh my gosh, how heightened am I at like any noise, any car that drives by, any person that like walks past me? I am heightened, right? And so I'm in that heightened state for so long, and I'm experiencing that in isolation for so long that eventually, yeah, that most primitive system can kick in,
Right.
because that's just not how we're meant to live.
Right. Right. Or what you were saying before, right? How was my body already? How is my physiology
Mm-hmm.
already? And then
Mm-hmm.
I'm cursed,
Mm-hmm.
and then I faint, or I feel this deep sense of hopelessness. My body's already vulnerable and already primed to sort of shut down, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then I shut down and then I die. And it's like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
these are all ways that this makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
you know. Um, and then the other part of this that I thought was really interesting is he basically calls out the ambiguity, right? He says in the book that this is probably because of that middle rung, that people are in that fight or flight and their heart rate gets so fast and so dysregulated
Mm-hmm.
that it just sort of like stops, right? Almost like someone jumping rope too fast, and they get tangled over their own feet and they just like collapse,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so he's saying that this is probably sympathetically activated.
Yeah.
This is probably because of the sympathetic system. But
Which, I mean, that can happen,
right, it can happen,
right? It
right?
can exert too much, right? And then your heart just bursts, or like it can't do it anymore.
Right.
That
Um,
happens.
it
But
it happens. But he also says basically that like it's not, he doesn't know for sure.
Mhm.
And he says there's another theory that says this is actually activated by the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what we would
Mhm.
say, you know, from a
Mhm.
polyvagal perspective, that happens because the parasympathetic nervous system takes over at that time. And that's
Yeah,
what
and
pushes
he
you.
does. Yeah, and he says in the book the vagus nerve takes over,
Yeah.
right? Because he equates, right, the parasympathetic with the vagus nerve. Um, and so you see that confusion, right? Of like, wait, I thought that because he's arguing like what a good thing the vagus nerve is and the parasympathetic is the whole book. And it's like, wait, that will kill you? Like, what do you mean? Where was this like character shift? It's like this is the hero of the book, and then but ultimately like it can lead to death. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And I think you're totally right, Jordan, that kind of like blank space that's left there is very much filled in by the polyvagal theory, saying this is really more about that ladder. This is really more about evolutionarily, how is my body assessing the most fitting response given the danger that's present.
Yeah. So I wanted to take this a little bit deeper, right? Because you were talking about the ladder. And I think for me, one of the hardest things to really grasp was this idea that our responses are on a hierarchy,
Mm-hmm.
that our responses are on a ladder. And so I want to give an example of what this means, right? We usually talk about it as we kind of start off in social engagement, safe and social. And if we face a challenge, we move down to fight or flight. And if that challenge can't be met by our fight or flight system, we move into faint, freeze, fold, right? Maybe some sort of death or something like that. But what this means is we kind of have to go through these stages to get to the next stage.
Mm-hmm.
And so my sister-in-law is a neonatal nurse, right? She works with preemie babies. And we were having a meal one day, and she was talking about how one of the big problems with their babies is sudden infant death syndrome, right? Where the hearts just stop. And that's how Portis got his start, right? Looking at how is it that the parasympathetic system cuts on, and this thing that's supposed to be calming and relaxing ends up leading to the deaths of these children. Right. So I'm like primed. I'm like on.
Yeah.
And she says one of the things that we do for these babies is we give them caffeine. And I was like, that's interesting, right? So I asked her for a quote, and this is what she says. And this is her, and I think I love this because I mean she's a nurse, she's very smart, but she's also a nurse. So she's giving you like a very practical sort of definition, right? She says basically, we give caffeine to the babies that have respiratory distress. Like, okay, that sounds like fading. They're not getting enough oxygen to their bodies. They're in that parasympathetic protective mode, and are going an apneic, right, which means that they're not breathing. That's another vocab word that I didn't know. So we give caffeine to our babies that have respiratory distress and are going apneic. It kind of gives them a boost of energy to help them remember to breathe. And what she's saying is when these babies are at the bottom of that ladder, when their parasympathetic system is going through this really protective mode and is saying, don't breathe, slow down, the way that they keep these babies alive is by giving them caffeine so that they get a little bit more mobilized. The heart rate picks up. So they're helping them move from the bottom rung of the ladder to the middle rung of the ladder. And I was like, that is crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see this in a counseling setting as well, too, right? When people are totally dissociated, right? They're not often able just to like jump back into social connection. There's often these like panicked responses in that place as they emerge from that dissociative state. And so it's kind of, we have to climb that ladder, right? And be able to distinguish between what response is most necessary for our bodies to really get what they need. I love that example, right? Because I think especially Jordan and I mean in babies, right, of this experience, it just shows kind of our most basic human functioning, right? And that little bit of mobilization gets us up to a higher order of processing, right? Activates the body in some ways. Not that we want to keep the baby there forever, right? But we need that, especially when that bottom rung, which we call the dorsal vagal branch, that's the one in charge of that freeze response. When we see someone slipping into that, the goal isn't to get them immediately into social connection. That's not going to be possible. But even if we can activate and get their bodies to activate a little bit around that space, that's a very good thing.
That makes so much sense. I remember having a client, he was in foster care. He was, I don't know, maybe eight or nine, maybe even younger. And he was so shut down. And I'd hang out with this kid at his house, at his foster house, and he would just dig in the dirt for hours. And that happened. And the foster parents were very happy with it. They were like, oh, he's such a good kid. He just sits and plays by himself. And I was like, this kid is not okay.
Yeah.
And then he got two older foster brothers, and they all became like a unit. And this kid started like stealing food and talking back and doing all these negative behaviors. And the foster parents were like, this is horrible. This kid is torn into a bad kid. And it's like, wait, from a polyvagal perspective, this kid, when he was playing in the dirt by himself, when he was shut down, was at the bottom rung of that ladder, right? He was in that sort of dorsal vagal state. He was in that protective sort of parasympathetic state. And when these kids came, it actually was a good thing. It pulled him up, right? So he was a little bit more engaged with them, but then you also got some of those negative behaviors, right?
Mhm.
Which are hard to deal with as a parent. I'm not going to say that they're
Yeah.
easy,
Yeah.
but what they didn't see and what I couldn't convey, and I don't think I really got this then either, was like, this is actually a sign of him moving up the ladder.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
This is actually a sign of him thawing out, actually responding to what's going on around. Like, he's actually getting healthier. But
Mhm.
unfortunately, what that means is now you got to deal with a little bit of aggression and a little bit of
Mhm.
defiance and a little bit, you know what I mean? All those sorts of
Mhm.
things. And it's like,
Yeah.
man, like, if I wish I could have conveyed that to them, I wish I had a full sense of that then,
Mhm.
that this is this kid actually getting healthier.
Yeah, which is hard because I just see these behaviors that I don't like,
Yeah.
right? But instead of just shutting down completely in response to stress, I can actually do something about it, right? And I can be mobilized. And our goal isn't that we stay right in that activated state, but eventually through the polyvagal lens, I'm able to reach out for connection and support, and be able to interact in that way as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
Um, okay, so we have about 15 minutes left. And there's two big bonus things I wanted to touch base with you about.
Mm.
Um, as I was reading through this chapter,
Mhm.
I feel like it's more and more clear to me some of the differences, even in how Porges and Sapolsky are approaching this thing, right? Some of these we talked about in the past. Porges is looking at your ability to co-regulate, your ability to
Mhm.
use a social engagement system.
Mhm.
And Sapolsky is looking at sort of the cognitive aspect, right? Like, how are you
Mhm.
perceiving different things?
Mhm.
Um, which I think is interesting.
Mhm.
Porges is looking at the vagus and the different branches of the vagus.
Mhm.
And Sapolsky is looking at a lot of the hormones that go on in the body, right?
Mhm.
Um, but another big thing that I've realized that they are looking at this thing very differently in is
Mhm.
Porges is looking at the intensity of the stressor, the
Mhm.
intensity of the stressor, and how the intensity of the stressor moves us down or up the ladder.
Mhm.
And Sapolsky is looking at the chronicity of the stressor, right?
Mhm.
You can have a low level stressor that goes on for a very long time.
Mhm.
And that's sort of what he talks about in this chapter, right? Of like, you can have a low level stressor that keeps you chronically um, irritated and gives you hypertension and
Mhm.
increases your chances of heart disease.
Mhm.
But that's different than like having a really big stressor that then pushes you into, fainting or freezing. Um,
Yeah,
so I thought that was really interesting, just a different way of even thinking about.
absolutely. And I think all of those differences really stem from through Porges's lens of polyvagal theory. He thinks that there can be more flexibility, right, between the way that the body responds to stress. It's not about eliminating stress, it's about preventing that rigidity so that we can have more options when stressful situations come up. And specifically, within those top two rungs, activating the social engagement system or ventral vagal complex, or when it's necessary, utilizing that fight or flight, because sometimes it is necessary.
Yeah.
Whereas Sapolsky doesn't. He sees it as this on or off switch, right? Where it's like, don't leave on the lights too long. Don't don't do that. Like, you're not gonna like the bill over time. It's gonna wear on everything over time. Like, shut it off. And you just see, because of their understandings of the way that the body responds to stress, they just have such different emphases, and it makes perfect sense. If it does work like an on and off switch, then let's seek to shut it off at times. But if there's a way for the body to still experience stress, but do it in a way that's less taxing to the body, that's probably going to be a lot more useful, because we can't train our bodies to not respond to stress.
Exactly. And I think that's dovetail into like the last thing that
Mhm.
was sort of a bonus. He makes this brief comment in this chapter about how when we breathe out,
Mm-hmm.
we slightly activate the parasympathetic nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
And when we breathe in, we slightly activate the sympathetic nervous system, right? So
Mm-hmm.
when we breathe out, our heart rate slowly, just a little bit slows down. And when we breathe in, our rate just a little bit speeds up.
Mm-hmm.
And this gets into a whole different field,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm talking to someone who knows a lot more about this than I do, about biofeedback, right?
Mm-hmm.
And flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you know about this, but there's a type of breathing called resonance frequency breathing, right? And resonance frequency breathing, which I learned about from a book called Heart, Breath, Mind by Leah Lagos, a phenomenal book. She takes you through the whole process. But the basic idea is, because when you breathe out, your heart slows down just a little bit. When you breathe in, your heart speeds up a little bit. That is a great measure of your sort of like overall physical health.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're looking for is, how flexible is that? How much does your heart slow down when you breathe out, and how much does it speed up when you breathe in? Because it's your body's ability to respond to that sort of thing, that flexibility in how it responds, that determines your physical health.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know you've taken a lot more classes on this and taught on this. Is that basically correct?
No, that's exactly right. And you're talking, what you're really talking about there is heart rate variability,
Right.
right? Which is, our heart rate is not perfectly consistent. And in fact, it's not even a good thing if it is. There's just some common variance in the way that our heart beats. But what we do see, and what we're seeing more in research too, which I find really interesting, is heart rate variability is actually being used now as a psychophysiological measurement of emotional regulation. So, not that we're trying to prevent heart rate variability from increasing, right? And usually, giant increases in heart rate variability means, oh, something stressful happened and I'm adjusting to it, right? Whereas if it's really small variability, there's not much change, that means I'm probably pretty steady state. Most of us live in a world where we're coming into contact with people, which means we have with a good thing, right, that our heart can adjust and have large amounts of variability when it's necessary. The thing is, where we're seeing it being used as a measure for emotional regulation, because how quickly can my heart rate be restored to that consistent rate, to having smaller variability after a stressful event? If it takes me 3 hours to calm down, right, and to bring my body back to a steady state after I get cut off in traffic, that is not good for my emotional regulation capacity, right? And it's not good for my body. And so what we're seeing in this is, how quickly can my body be restored, right, to that calmer way of being, that's a gauge for emotional regulation. And that's why resonance frequency breathing is kind of training your body of how to restore itself to that regulated place. That even in when moments of distress come up, I can train my body to get back into a mode where things are level and calm and restored there.
Yeah. And that goes back to what you were saying about flexibility, right? Of like, okay, what we're really going for here is flexibility. Flexibility is reflected not just like mentally, but also like in your body. Like, how does your heart, how flexible is your heart rate? Is there a good level of variability? Is there a good level of flexibility in your heart rate? And if so, that's a really good measure for your physical health and also for your mental health.
Right.
And a way to train that heart rate variability is the resonance frequency breathing, right? Breathing at a rate. And she says this in the book, that in general, and there's flexibility because people are all different, but in general, breathing at a rate of 6 seconds out and 4 seconds in, so that your out breath is a little bit longer than your in breath, that's what trains our heart to have more variability, more flexibility, which leads to better emotional response. It's a better emotional responding, and also like, better physical health, which is just like, to me, that was fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because us being able to kind of bring our bodies back down is how we keep all of those very dangerous effects from having from long-term sources of stress that we talked about earlier today.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Conroy, we are almost out of time. What's your takeaway? What's your sort of your closing thought from this section on the heart?
Well, if you'll forgive me, I think I'm going to get a little bit cheesy. Since we've been talking about the heart anyway. I think the best thing that I'm taking away is, oh my gosh, how much hope does this open up, that this doesn't have to be a fixed state, that heart disease and high blood pressure and hypertension, they don't have to be a fixed state. I don't want to ignore the genetics and the biological contributing factors here, right? But also, like, there is hope if I'm able to find ways to down regulate myself in a way that's appropriate and healthy and promotes that regulatory capacity. There's a lot of hope, because I've loved to live in a world without stress. I plan to one day. That's not coming as far as I can see anytime soon. And so it's not that I can ever avoid feeling that stress, but how can I stay regulated in spite of it? And so I think that that's just such a hopeful message that I'm walking out of today with.
Yeah, that hope. That's great. I have like 3 big takeaways, which is probably too much. I think for me, one of the big takeaways was just all the vocab.
Mm.
It just clarified a lot of those terms about myself,
Mm-hmm.
my body, that I had never had an explanation for and put in context, right?
Mm.
Hypertension, myocardial infarction, arterial sclerosis, all the, I'm like, oh, okay, this is what these things mean.
Mm-hmm.
I think also, I'm a big fan of resonance frequency breathing, of training your HRV, for various reasons. I do a little bit of that most mornings, and I found it very helpful. And so I think, from a practical standpoint, I would recommend people like check out the book, look into Leah Lagos, and just like experience it. And I think for me, going through that experientially helped me a lot better to be in touch with my own physiology, right? For me to be able, because I had because I could sit down, feel what it felt like to do the breathing and to get really balanced. I then had a contrast to say, oh wait, right now I'm off. That really increased my own bodily awareness, which then helps me to regulate myself better, because then I can say, wait, I'm off. I need to go talk to my wife, or I'm off. I need to go, I don't know, go for a walk, or I'm off and I need to go and like talk to somebody in the office. It just really gave me a better felt sense of when I was on and when I was off.
Yeah.
So I would recommend people check that out. And then I think for me personally, the other really big thing is thinking about this with my client who would dig in the dirt, because it really helped me to see him differently and to see how him, and probably a lot of kids who are quiet, withdrawn, sullen, who are then sort of praised for good behavior, are actually really struggling on the inside.
Yeah.
And so for me, those were like the big things that I was like, oh wow, this is so huge. So
Beautiful takeaways there, Dr. Harris.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Conroy. All right. Well, look, I'll see you next time, okay?
All right. Thank you so much. This has been fun.
All right.